What are all these parentheses? What's up with these dollar signs? Escaping? Like, who are we running from? Trailing, closure syntax, what does that even mean? Look, closures are tough. These are all things that confuse the hell out of me way deeper into my career than I'd like to admit. Let's make sure you understand closures a lot faster than I did. Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Closures are self-contained blocks of functionality that can be passed around and used in your code. To put that simply, they're functions that can be passed around. To illustrate that, let's create a closure and put it to good use. Here I am in my Xcode playground. All I have is an object of a student that has a name and a test score, and then I have an array of those student types. We're going to create a closure to filter out the students by their test score. Var top student filter, and that is of type. Now, of type is the key word here to explain this, because just like our student has a name that is of type string, a test score that is of type int, our closure is a variable that is of type, and this is where the parentheses come in. It's essentially the function signature. So I'm going to type this out and we'll walk through and explain it. So you get one set of parentheses, and then the return type is the other set of parentheses, and that equals, and then the actual curly braces to define the scope. So let's walk through these parentheses one by one, because I know this confused me greatly when I was first learning closures. So the first set of parentheses is any parameters the function takes in. However, we don't need to name them, we just need the type. So we want to take in a type of student. Now, of course, if you're doing something with an int or a string, that's where you would pass this in. We're dealing with our custom type here of student, so that's why we passed in that. And then this is going to return a Boolean. I'm going to back up and explain this real quick, because you may have seen, sometimes it doesn't return anything. So you may see empty parentheses, or sometimes if it doesn't return anything, you can see void as well. Those empty parentheses and void are the same thing, just two different ways to say it. In our case, we're going to pass in a Boolean because this is a filter. We're going to look at our student, and if our student has a score of greater than 80, we're going to return true. That means they're our top student. So that's why we passed in a student and returned a Boolean. We just want to check if they have a score greater than 80. So return student, but we can't do this quite yet. We're missing a piece here where we need to name our parameter here, student in. You've seen this before. So this is basically the parameter name, so we can use it down here in the scope of our closure. So I can do return student.test_. I don't know why the autocomplete is not cooperating, but greater than 80. Let me run it real quick just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Should be good. Cool, everything is good to go. And actually, maybe this will help. Let's write this as a function so you can compare the two, because I'm assuming you're familiar with functions a bit. So I just copied and pasted that. So to write a function, right, it's func top student filter. I'm going to put an F after it for function. And then instead of having all this right here, I'm just going to go ahead and delete that, right? You would say, hey, this takes in a student of type student. It returns a Boolean, and here's our scope. And we would say return student.test_. Greater than, we'll say 70. So to compare the function, and by the way, these are very similar. You can even use the function. You'll see we'll do that in a second. But I just kind of want to put these side by side so you can see how similar it is. Like I said, it's a property with a name of type, just like, string and int. The type here is the function signature, right? It takes in a type of student and returns a bool. That's what's going on here. Type of student returns a bool. And then here, the student is what we named it. We can name it whatever we want, just like we can name this parameter name anything we want. And then you see, obviously, in the scope is basically the same. So hopefully that clears up what these parentheses are when you see that in the closures. Again, it's just any parameters and what it returns, just like a function, parameters and what it returns. So now that we've defined our closure up here in top student filter has a T, there we go. But anyway, now that we have our closure, we're gonna pass it around using our variable. So let's do that. Let's say, let top students equal students, by the way, students is our array up here. This is our array of all of our students, dot filter. And you can see our filter takes in a closure. And just like we said, here is the type, takes in a student, and it returns a Boolean. So the only way we're going to be able to pass in our closure is if it matches that perfectly, right? It takes in a student and returns a Boolean. Let's say our closure up here had a student and an int, right? By the way, this is how you can have multiple types, maybe student-age. If you had multiple types in your closure, I guess it'd be multiple parameters. Now our closure wouldn't work because it doesn't match exactly. So I'm going to delete that because I want it to work. So now I can just pass in top student filter. And now let me paste in a quick little for loop to save some time. Just basically just prints off the student name. We'll run it and that filter should work. Yes, we have Luke, Leia, and Ahsoka. Those scores have to be greater than 80, right? Luke has an 88. Leia 95, Ahsoka in 86. So our filter is working by passing in our closure there. Again, closure is a function that can be passed around. And this is a lot neater than if we wrote it out. So let's demonstrate that. Well, real quick, let me demonstrate how we can also pass in this function. So let me do top student filter with a capital F at the end, right? That's what this is up here. And then now when I run it, remember we're greater than 70. This is why I did this, so we can differentiate. So now when I run it, I should get a longer list of students, which I do because more students up here are greater than 70. So again, whether it's a property or a function, very similar. A closure is a function that can be passed around and used. Now that you've seen that, let's start talking about shorthand and what all these dollar signs mean. So I'm gonna rewrite this filter here, or re-autocomplete it here. So filter is included. So as you can see, this is gonna give me a closure that takes in a student and returns a Boolean. If I hit return, I get a little bit of the shorthand and it automatically goes to trailing closure syntax, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, but the introduction, if I do Command Z, trailing closure syntax is when you can omit this argument label when your closure is the last argument. We'll talk a lot about that in SwiftUI because SwiftUI uses that heavily a little bit more in the video, but our closure is our only parameter, so of course it's our last parameter. So when I hit return, we get trailing closure syntax, which is omitting the parameter names in the parentheses and just going right into the body of the closure like that. So now we have our argument name, and we don't have to define the type. The reason we don't have to define the type is because it knows it's running filter on an array of students, right? Our students array right here has type inference. It knows it's an array of students. It's not an array of strings, it's not an array of doubles or anything like that. It's students. So that's why we don't need to define the type. We can just call this whatever we want. You can see the capital S for student means it's the student type. We're gonna name it lowercase student just as the name. Again, we could have named this person, right? You can name it whatever you want. Student obviously makes the most sense, but we know it's of type student. So here we can write the same code. So I'm using simple one lines of code, but obviously this could have been 40 lines. It could have been super complex filtering code. That is why you might not want to write it out all at once. You might want to put it away into a property so it can be reused, passed around very easily, versus right now, I'm writing it out like on site within the scope of the filter. Again, it looks fine right now because it's just one line of code. But I want to use this simple example to show you the shorthand. These parameters come with a built-in shorthand syntax. You've probably seen $0 or $1. What that represents is each parameter here. So right now we only have one, so it's $0. In a second, I'll show you an example where we have $0 and $1. So how I can slowly make this shorthand is, if I don't want to use the actual named property here, get rid of that and get rid of the in. And then now instead of student down here, I can replace that with $0. Because I only have one argument, there is no $1, it's just $0, so I know that's the student. And now when we only have one line of code, we can omit the return. And if we're gonna omit the return, we can put this all on one line to be nice, neat, and clean. So that's your introduction to the shorthand and what the $0 and the $1 is. So right now we just have top students. We filtered out all the top students based on if their test score is greater than 80. Now let's actually sort this so you can see an example of $0 and $1 and just more repetition on closures, because again, closures are tough. So let's say let student ranking equal top students, so we only want to take the top students, dot sorted by, and here again, you can see this is an example when we have two of these parameters. We have student 1 and student 2, and it returns a Boolean. So if we were to write a closure for this one, we would have to make sure we had two students in it, right? So we'd have to be student, and then of course we would write different logic to do all the sorting here. But like I said, I just want to point out that, oh, and we would also here have to have student 2. But I wanted to point out that if you are going to use a closure in a built-in like sorted or filter, it has to match exactly, or if you wrote a function yourself, it has to match exactly. So I'm gonna do a Command Z to get our closure back to that. And I'm gonna hit return and walk through that shorthand again. So like I said, you could have student 1, student 2, and then do return student 1 dot test score greater than student 2 dot test score. And this will sort them based on whose test score is higher. But again, back to the shorthand, we don't need student 1, student 2. I know that is $0 and $1, so we can get rid of that to make it cleaner. And then I'll replace student 1 with $0 and student 2 with $1. Now, if you had 3 or 4 parameters up there, it would be $2, $3, and so on. Like I said before, we don't need the return, so we can put this on one line, and there you go. So like I said, if you've seen a lot of these closures with the dollar signs and $1, $2, those are essentially shorthand syntax for each property like we just showed with the student and student 1 and student 2. I hope that cleared up all the $ syntax for you. I know that was confusing for me as well when I was starting out. Let's talk about trailing closure syntax before we get on to escaping. Let's go to a SwiftUI project to see how this is everywhere in SwiftUI. Here I am in my course called Grub. By the way, you can check this out, seanallen.teachable.com if you're interested. If you've ever written a VStack or an HStack in SwiftUI, you've used trailing closure syntax. And if you've written a lot of SwiftUI, you've done that many, many times. So let me explain that. Here I am in just a basic little button. Let's say I wanted to put this text in a VStack. So I do that. VStack, cool. Now, when you wrote the VStack, you just did open curly brace, close curly brace. And you probably thought nothing of it if you didn't understand trailing closures. But that's what it is. It's a trailing closure. So let's talk about what a VStack really is. So if I do VStack, hold Option to get all the parameters there, right? They're just optional. And SwiftUI is riddled with optional parameters and default values. I'll show you that in a second. But what I want to point out to you is, cool, here's a parameter. You can do dot leading, spacing, we'll say 10. But look, what does it end with? It ends with content. And what does that syntax look like to you? That looks like a closure. And the closure is the last argument. So we can omit it and just do the trailing closure syntax, which is just going right into the body of the closure, the braces. And real quick to show you, if I command click onto the VStack, jump to definition, go to the init here, you can see the alignment has a default value of .center. Spacing, default value of nil. So like I said, default values are everywhere in SwiftUI. That's what allows that clean syntax. And here you go. Does this look familiar? Well, at view builder, that's a different topic. But you can see the last argument is a content. That closure looks familiar, right? It takes in no parameters and it returns of type content. So back to the VStack real quick. That is why we can get rid of this. And that's why you can write a VStack, which is a simple VStack, open curly brace, close curly brace, trailing closure syntax all over SwiftUI. Before we talk about escaping closures, I gotta tell you about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to help you get that iOS developer portfolio, blog, or personal website up and running very quickly. Now I know, we're all developers with the skills and the desire to build the web page ourselves, but I would argue there's an opportunity cost to your time. If you're an iOS developer trying to build a great product, a great app, maybe spending a lot of time learning the ins and outs of web development, responsive design, isn't the best way to spend your time. That's why I recommend Squarespace to build that personal website, the blog, your portfolio, or maybe a landing page for your app. They have all kinds of beautiful themes and templates to get you started. They handle all the analytics and the SEO for you. Again, it just saves you so much time so you can get back to doing what you want to do, and that is building iOS apps. So when you're ready to get started, go to squarespace.com to start your free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/SeanAllen to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. If you've ever written a network call prior to async await, you've dealt with completion handlers or closures. They're the same thing. Let's take a look at this function signature for get followers. By the way, this goes up to the GitHub API, pulls down a list of followers to display on screen. Okay, so parameters, username, page, completed though. This is the closure here, and it's marked at escaping. We're gonna talk about what that means. But to review the closure, right, our closure takes in a result type, and the result type returns a follower or a GF error, and then it returns void. So it doesn't return anything. So again, like I said, this could easily be just close parentheses, same exact thing. But why is it marked at escaping? Well, the closures that we were doing before, like when we were filtering the students, those happen instantly, right? They get called right away, they happen right away, no big deal. On network calls, this fires off and it goes up into the cloud to GitHub API, and depending on your network, right, it could be super slow. Could take 10 seconds, could take a millisecond. Maybe you're not even connected to the internet, could take forever. So what escaping does is it allows the closure to live on past the lifetime of the function that called it. Speaking of the function that called it, let's actually go look at that. So on the follower list VC, which is that screen, you can see here in the get followers function, I call networkmanager.share.getFollowers. And again, as you see here, we're using the trailing closure syntax because that is the last argument in the function. But what happens? Get followers fires off, and then that function is done. However, the closure is still living. It outlives the function because it is waiting to get the information back from the network call. So that is why you mark it at escaping, so it can live on past that. Now this is where things get a little tricky with retain cycles and memory leaks, because most of the time when you do a network call, you're capturing a reference to self. Because once you get the list of followers back, whether it's 10 seconds later, 15 seconds later, 1 second later, you have to update the UI on the phone. So our closure still has to have a reference to whatever called it. In this case, it's a view controller in UIKit. So that's why you got to be careful with escaping closures. We marked it weak self here, so it's a weakly held reference, so it can break. That gets into memory management, automatic reference counting, all that stuff. It's a whole other topic. I have a video on that. I'll link to that in the description if you want. But that's what escaping means. Essentially, the closure has to live on past the life of the function that originally called it. If this was helpful and you enjoyed my teaching style, check out my courses at seanallen.teachable.com. See you in the next video.